The medieval street was a living creature of noise, scent, motion, and unpredictable danger. To picture it, imagine standing in a narrow lane where every structure on both sides leans inward as if trying to touch the building across from it. The walls are timber framed, patched with age, sagging slightly with the weight of time. The sky is visible only as a strip above you, and beneath your feet lies a path that is more mud than stone. This space is not simply a street, it is a meeting place of commerce, travel, work, animals, refuse, and the steady rhythm of daily survival. Yet within this crowded, uneven, ever-changing space, medieval people slowly developed practical safety habits to stop accidents before they ended in grief. The ground comes first in this story because it was often the first hazard. A medieval street could be soft and deep, with mud after a rainfall, packed hard and rutted during dry seasons, or slick and treacherous when frost set in. Stone paving did exist in many towns, but its condition depended entirely on maintenance that could be delayed for months or even seasons. In wealthier towns, especially market centers visited by traders, there might be patches of cobblestone, yet even those could become uneven, cracked, or raised, forming awkward steps that caught unsuspecting feet. A simple walk demanded attention. People learned to stare downward, not out of shyness, but out of survival. The idea of strolling without watching one's steps would have been unthinkable. Animals added another unpredictable layer. A market day brought not only townsfolk but livestock. The goats tugged at their ropes. Pigs trotted stubbornly through crowds. Dogs, both stray and owned, moved with complete confidence, as if every street belonged entirely to them. Horses pulling carts could be skittish, especially in tight lanes, where sound echoed loudly between timber walls. In any moment, a cow could lower its head and swing its horns in irritation, or a horse could kick if startled by a sudden clang of metal. Medieval people learned to keep distance from the hindquarters of large animals for the same reason modern riders do, but in crowded conditions, this was easier said than done. A simple mistake could lead to bruises, broken bones, or worse. Market stalls narrowed the walking spaces further. The town authorities might designate a central area for vendors, but sellers expanded beyond their assigned spots to reach more customers. Their goods spilled outward into the lanes. Meat hung from hooks. Pots of grain sat close to the ground. Bakers placed baskets of warm bread near the edge of the walkway. No safety tape or rails marked these boundaries. Instead, each stallholder relied on their voice, shouting warnings when a customer backed away too far or when a horse approached. Over time, people developed an instinctive awareness of their surroundings, a kind of gentle weaving between objects and bodies. Even so, collisions happened often, especially when someone carried a load that blocked their view. Noise filled the air and played its own part in accidents. The clatter of iron, the hollering of merchants, the bleating of animals, the rumble of wooden wheels, the conversation of travelers, and the rhythmic tapping of craftsmen at work created a constant curtain of sound. A person might not hear a cart approaching from behind until the wheels were nearly at their heels. Bells rang to announce the hour or to signal that an important official was passing. Church bells sounded often throughout the day, sometimes startling animals or prompting crowds to move quickly toward the square. Noise was part of life, but also part of danger. Refuse disposal was another hazard. Streets were rarely clean. While towns did develop rules about where waste could be thrown, enforcement varied. People tossed dirty water from upper windows with a quick shout downward as a courtesy warning. Someone too distracted to step aside could be drenched in water, ashes, or food scraps. It was unpleasant but also slippery when it splashed onto the uneven ground. Animal droppings were everywhere, creating steady risk of slipping. Mud mixed with straw and refuse formed thick patches where carts could get stuck or where people might lose their footing. Despite all this, medieval towns tried to impose a sense of order. Informal rules emerged first. People learned to walk on one side of the street out of habit rather than law. They shifted aside for nobility or clergy, who traveled with attendants calling for space. Over many generations, this instinct to slide to one side helped reduce head-on collisions. Some towns even began marking preferred walking paths with long stones set near the edges, guiding foot traffic much like the curbs we know today. They were not perfect, nor were they present everywhere, but where they existed, they gave structure to the flow of movement. Another safety habit involved watching for carts. Carters often shouted as they advanced, announcing their presence with practiced phrases. Medieval travelers learned to treat these calls as alerts, stepping closer to the walls to give carts room to pass. In narrow lanes, a person pressed their back against the timber wall while a cart scraped by with inches to spare. Children were taught early to listen for these warnings. Such crowd behavior might seem chaotic, yet it became a predictable pattern that allowed people to function safely within the unpredictable environment. The upper stories of buildings created danger. Two medieval homes frequently featured jettied levels, meaning each higher floor extended further outward over the street. These extensions gave people extra living space, but also reduced sunlight reaching the ground below. The reduced light made walking more difficult, especially in late afternoon. Shadows formed pockets where uneven stones or refuse hid from sight. People learned to step more cautiously in these dim places. They also learned not to linger beneath upper windows, where household waste might suddenly fall. Many of these safety habits arose without official regulation. They were communal solutions to communal problems, but eventually local authorities did step in. Town councils introduced simple rules about where stalls could be placed, how waste should be disposed of, and where carts could travel at different times of day. In some towns, large carts were forbidden during peak market hours to prevent crushing accidents. In others, vendors were required to keep a small clear space in front of their stalls, giving pedestrians a safer walkway. One of the more subtle safety concerns involved fire within the street. Open flames were part of daily urban life. Smiths worked with hot coals, cooks set up portable hearths, and torches illuminated night passage. A poorly tended flame could ignite tarred wood, straw roofing, or the clothing of a passerby. People learned to avoid walking too near temporary fires. Towns gradually introduced basic rules requiring portable hearths to be set on stones rather than directly on the ground, lowering the risk of scattering embers. These were gentle steps, but meaningful ones. The presence of travelers added both opportunity and danger. A medieval town was a crossroads of cultures, languages, and goods. Travelers rode or walked into crowded lanes looking for lodging or trade. They were not always familiar with local customs, making them more vulnerable to mishaps. Locals recognized this and sometimes guided them, not only out of hospitality, but to prevent disruptive accidents. Some inns provided lanterns for guests venturing out at night to ensure they could navigate the dim lanes with fewer stumbles. Crowds were a danger in themselves. During festivals, markets, or public gatherings, streets filled beyond capacity. Pressure from behind could push people into carts, animals, or stalls. To reduce this, towns began stationing watchmen or stewards at busy junctions. Their job was not law enforcement in the modern sense, but gentle crowd management. They kept lanes open, directed movement, and watched for signs of panic. This practice was an early form of what we might now call event safety. Seasonal hazards changed the rhythm of danger. Winter brought ice that turned sloping lanes into silent traps. Spring brought rains that transformed ground into sludge deep enough to steal a shoe. Summer brought heat that warped wooden wheels and caused carts to veer unexpectedly. Autumn brought winds strong enough to shake loose shutters or tiles from upper stories. Every season shaped different behaviors. People walked differently, listened differently, and prepared differently, depending on the time of year. The medieval street was more than a path. It was a communal artery where life pulsed every hour of every day. Dangers lurked everywhere, yet people learned to navigate them with remarkable awareness. Over time, these small personal habits combined with the earliest civic rules to create a landscape that, while still hazardous, gradually grew safer. Humans are adaptive, and even without modern tools or engineering, medieval townsfolk developed their own set of simple, thoughtful precautions. This section lays the foundation for understanding how safety thinking slowly emerged in medieval daily life. The street was only the beginning. In the following sections, the night itself becomes another world of dangers and solutions. Nightfall transformed the medieval street into a different world. Daytime brought its own hazards, but once the sun dipped beyond the horizon, a fresh set of dangers unfolded. Darkness in medieval towns was not the gentle dim of modern street lamps. It was deep, heavy, and often absolute. A person walking after sunset stepped into an environment shaped by shadow, uncertainty, and sound. Yet medieval communities developed a number of simple but meaningful safety measures to help their people navigate these hours. They did not eliminate danger, yet they softened its impact and taught townsfolk how to move with care. To imagine the medieval night, picture narrow lanes already dim beneath overhanging buildings. Now strip away the faint daylight that filtered through the wood-framed houses. The street becomes a place where outlines blur and distances deceive. Objects appear larger or smaller than they are. A cart left near a wall turns into an unclear mass. A loose stone waits unseen beneath the foot. A wandering dog becomes a silent shape until it is almost at your legs. Even familiar routes appear foreign. This disorientation was perhaps the most universal hazard of medieval night travel. The first line of nighttime safety came from household lighting. Families kept candles, rushlights, or simple oil lamps to brighten the interior of their homes. In wealthier towns, households placed lanterns near windows or doorways during late hours, letting soft light spill into the street. It was not strong enough to illuminate lanes entirely, but it created pockets of visibility where pedestrians could pause, orient themselves, and adjust their eyes. These small islands of light acted as reference points. People walking at night would move from lit doorway to lit doorway, almost like stepping stones of sight in an ocean of darkness. Candles and rushlights however, carried their own dangers. They dripped hot wax, toppled easily, and could ignite straw, cloth, or dry wood in moments. Households learned simple techniques to reduce these risks. A shallow dish might catch falling wax. Lamps were hung from hooks rather than placed on unsteady tables. Some towns even encouraged the use of lanterns instead of open flames because lanterns enclosed the fire and reduced the chance of accidents. These domestic adjustments not only made homes safer, but also gave the streets safer points of light. Public lighting existed in some medieval towns, though it was limited. The few larger cities placed torches or lamps at key intersections. Watchmen or night guards were often responsible for lighting and maintaining these. Their flickering glow created small but important pockets of safety. People used them as landmarks. Streets with a known lamp became preferred routes. The knowledge spread by word of mouth. If someone needed to walk home late, they would almost always choose the better lit path, even if it added extra minutes to their journey. Watchmen were among the most important nighttime safety features. Their duty extended beyond watching for wrongdoing. They provided a sense of structure to the night. A watchman patrolled with a lantern, a staff, sometimes a horn or bell, and most importantly, a voice. Their steady footsteps and occasional calls served as a reminder that someone was awake and overseeing the sleeping town. They warned travelers of hazards, pointed out obstacles, or guided lost individuals back to safer main routes. The presence of a watchman reassured townsfolk that dangers were at least acknowledged, if not entirely removed. Watchmen also enforced curfews, which were common safety measures in towns and cities. Curfews were not always strict or punitive. Instead, they served as a protective rhythm. By limiting movement during dangerous hours, authorities hoped to reduce nighttime accidents. With fewer people wandering through deep darkness, there were fewer falls, fewer collisions, fewer unsuspecting encounters with animals, and fewer opportunities for mischief. When the town bell rang a curfew signal, people understood it as a gentle prompt to return indoors. Travelers arriving late hurried to find lodging before the curfew ended. Night signals played a vital role in shaping safe nighttime behavior. Bells marked the passage of evening hours. Some towns used a pattern of chimes to signal different stages of night. One bell might indicate that taverns should close. Another might warn households to extinguish their larger fires to prevent nighttime sparks from spreading. A later bell might mark the shift change for watchmen. These sounds created a sense of order during a time when sight could not be relied upon. People listened closely, learning to interpret these signals as cues for safety. Darkness changed how people communicated. During the day, gestures, glances, and body language did much of the work. At night, voices became the primary tool. Groups walking after sunset developed habitual ways of speaking to one another. They gave frequent verbal updates. They warned each other about puddles, steps, or obstacles. Even strangers walking the same direction shared warnings. Medieval night travel was surprisingly cooperative. People understood that one person's accident could easily involve everyone nearby. Lantern carrying became a necessary skill. A lantern was not merely held, but managed. Its position changed depending on terrain. Held higher, it illuminated surrounding shapes. Held lower, it revealed the condition of the ground. Travelers learned to angle their lanterns to avoid blinding their companions with sudden glare. The slow swinging of lantern light created rhythmic shadows, revealing motion before form. This subtle dance between flame and shadow offered clues about upcoming hazards. Despite all these measures, danger still lingered. Without widespread artificial lighting, night travel always carried risk. People frequently lost their way, especially in towns with twisting, irregular street layouts. A wrong turn might lead to a dead end or an unfamiliar quarter. In such cases, watchmen acted as guides, directing wanderers toward known inns or squares. Some towns even assigned specific watch posts as safe rest points where late travelers could wait for guidance. Animals, quieter at night, remained a threat. Dogs roamed freely. Cats slinked along rooftops. Horses kept in nearby stables might wander if a latch failed to hold. Animals do not rely on sight the same way humans do, so they moved with more confidence in the dark. A dog startled in the street could create unexpected chaos. To reduce this, some towns required that animals be tied or enclosed after sunset. It was far from perfect, but it reduced surprise encounters. Another nighttime hazard came from thieves or mischief makers. While watchmen served as deterrents, they could not be everywhere. Towns recognized this and tried to design nighttime rules that discouraged people from giving thieves opportunities. Some towns banned carrying uncovered flames late at night, fearing that thieves could use flames as signals. Others required night travelers to call out periodically as they walked, making their presence known and discouraging would-be troublemakers from lurking unseen. Nighttime building hazards also posed risks. Loose shutters, hanging signs, or poorly secured goods stored on upper levels could fall without warning. During strong winds, these items became dangerous projectiles in the narrow lanes. As a safety measure, some towns required shopkeepers to secure their hanging signs at night. Households took care to bring in items that might fall. These small precautions helped reduce sudden accidents. Weather conditions were magnified by darkness. Rain made cobblestones slick. A person could easily misjudge the angle of a slope and slip. Frost made even familiar roads unpredictable. Fog wrapped the streets in a haze that turned lantern light into a soft glow barely inches beyond the flame. People adapted by learning the layouts of their towns in great detail. They memorized landmarks by touch and sound. A certain jut of stone or the creak of a particular sign told them where they were. The night created an unusual relationship between townsfolk and fire. Fire could protect, but it also threatened. Households dimmed their hearts at night to avoid sparks. Watchmen monitored for signs of smoke and listened for the telltale crackle of flames. Bells existed as an early warning system. Fire at night was especially dangerous because darkness slowed reaction time. Townspeople trained themselves to wait quickly at the sound of bells. Although not formally called fire drills, these shared habits functioned as early emergency response routines. Signaling methods grew more refined as towns developed. Some settlements used horns instead of bells. The low, resonant note of a horn carried through narrow lanes and helped people orient themselves when visibility was minimal. Horn patterns might signal a lost traveler, a disturbance, or a call for assistance. These sound codes were simple yet effective. People learned them as naturally as one learns lullabies during childhood. Nighttime travel was sometimes essential. Merchants arriving late from long journeys needed to enter towns after sunset. Physicians might be summoned to treat a late-night illness. Midwives were often called to attend births at unpredictable hours. For these vital movements, communities sometimes permitted special lantern privileges. A person carrying an official town lantern was recognized as someone allowed to travel freely. People cleared paths for them, and watchmen offered guidance rather than enforcing curfew rules upon them. Over the centuries, as medieval towns grew, nighttime safety strategies improved. Better management of watch rotations ensured fewer gaps in patrol coverage. Some towns tested fixed lantern posts placed at intervals along major routes. Others developed more formalized training for watchmen, teaching them how to spot hazardous conditions. Still, the heart of nighttime safety remained the same: careful movement, community cooperation, and awareness shaped by generations of experience. Der Sentinelbeat died cannot be understood only as dangerous. It also held a quiet beauty. With most people indoors, the lanes fell nearly silent. Lantern flames cast warm circles of light on damp stones. The gentle call of a watchman echoed softly. The world slowed. This peacefulness, however, existed only because people had learned how to navigate the dangers with respect and caution. Every nighttime safety measure grew from hard-earned wisdom. Nightfall taught medieval communities two powerful lessons. First, darkness demanded preparation. Second, safety required shared effort. Families, travelers, merchants, and officials all contributed to making the night survivable. These efforts did not remove danger entirely, but they softened the sharpest edges of it. As we move toward the next section, the story of the medieval street continues. If night introduced a world of hazards shaped by darkness, then the structure of the street itself shaped the risks of daylight. Raised walkways, protective barriers, and simple architectural choices formed the next stage of medieval safety thinking. They reveal how people continued refining their environment in quiet but meaningful ways. The medieval street during daylight was a place of constant movement, yet beneath the noise and bustle existed a quiet effort to make that movement safer. Over many generations, townsfolk and local officials shaped their streets not only for commerce, but also for protection. Their solutions were simple, born from practical experience rather than grand engineering. Still, these modest improvements helped guide people through crowded lanes with fewer injuries. This section explores the subtle architectural choices, walking habits, and early structural additions that formed the backbone of medieval street safety. To understand these features, picture the street again as morning light spreads across the uneven ground. Shops open their shutters. Bakers place trays of warm bread near their doorway. Smiths hammer at metal beneath open awnings. Children carry water from public wells. Carts roll by, pulled by tired horses. Foot traffic fills every open space. Amid this lively flow, medieval towns began to introduce small but meaningful ways to shape movement. One of the earliest and simplest safety features was the raised walkway. These walkways, sometimes only a few inches high, ran along one or both sides of a lane. They were made from stone slabs, packed earth, or timber, depending on local materials. Their purpose was not entirely the same as modern sidewalks. Instead of separating pedestrians from carts completely, they lifted walkers just enough to keep them out of the deepest mud and away from the unpredictable splash of passing wheels. In many towns, especially older ones with sloping terrain, These raised walkways offered the safest surface available. Walking upon a raised path required balance. Medieval footwear lacked the firm soles we know today. Many shoes were soft, flexible, and better suited for gripping uneven earth than polished stone. As a result, individuals learned to step carefully when using elevated paths. However, once mastered, raised walkways gave a sense of stability and predictability. People preferred them during rainy seasons when lower ground turned into thick mud. Families walking together often placed children on the raised side to avoid slips. Some towns added shallow gutters between the walkway and the main street. These gutters guided water away from the walking path and helped prevent flooding. Without them, a sudden downpour could transform a lane into a stream. The placement of these drainage channels required understanding how water naturally flowed through the settlement. Over years, towns adjusted their layouts, shifting gutters, deepening them, or adding simple stone linings. These improvements protected both pedestrians and animals from unexpected puddles that might conceal hazards beneath. Protective rails were rare, but not unknown. In places with steep drops, such as towns built on hillsides, simple wooden rails prevented wagons from rolling off edges and gave pedestrians something to grip while descending. These rails were not decorative. They were often rough, utilitarian beams hammered into posts. Their presence signaled that the ground ahead could be treacherous. Travelers in these towns grew accustomed to gripping the rail with one hand, especially during wet seasons when slopes became slick. Another architectural safety practice involved the shaping of corners. Medieval towns did not always grow according to a grand plan. Lanes twisted and turned in odd directions, following property lines or terrain. Sharp corners became collision points where carts, animals, and pedestrians met unexpectedly. To soften these dangerous intersections, some towns smoothed corners by trimming away parts of buildings. These shaved corners created slightly wider turning arcs, reducing sudden encounters. Although modest, this was an intentional step toward managing movement safely. In more active streets, shopkeepers took responsibility for the space directly in front of their establishments. They swept debris, spread fresh straw to absorb moisture, or placed wooden planks to bridge deep puddles. While done primarily for business, these efforts benefited everyone. A neatly maintained shopfront created a safer pocket for pedestrians to pause or bypass a busy patch of road. Some shopkeepers even arranged small markers placed against the wall, reminding travelers not to lean too closely where hanging signs might sway. Architectural overhangs were another unique feature that carried mixed blessings. Jettied upper stories saved ground space and allowed families more room indoors, yet the extended shadows created dim spots even during daylight. To counter this, some towns allowed small openings or slits in upper walls to channel sunlight downward. These tiny architectural choices brightened narrow lanes just enough to make walking less hazardous. They were early demonstrations of how people adapted structures not only for comfort but also for safety. Informal walking rules also evolved. In many crowded towns, people began moving in a predictable pattern, keeping to one side during busy hours. It was not a law but a habit taught from childhood. Parents instructed children to walk along the edges of the street unless crossing was necessary. Travelers learned to listen for the rhythm of approaching carts and adjust their steps accordingly. This collective awareness mattered greatly in markets where paths were narrow and crowds thick. Merchants and carters added to this early traffic etiquette. A cart driver would signal their approach with practiced shouts. Some used a short wooden rattle or tapped their cart frame with a stick. These sounds acted like early travel warnings. Pedestrians heard them and knew immediately to give space. Over time, these warning calls became recognized patterns. People distinguished between the call of a passing cart, the cry of a herder guiding animals, and the shout of a porter carrying heavy goods. Each sound carried its own meaning. Carts themselves adapted to safety needs. In particularly crowded towns, narrower carts became common. Their slimmer frames eased movement through tight lanes and reduced the chance of clipping pedestrians. Some towns enforced simple rules, restricting larger wagons during market hours, guiding heavy traffic to less crowded routes. While basic by modern standards, such measures helped reduce injuries caused by carts rolling too close to shop fronts or pinning unwary walkers against walls. Shop signs added character to medieval streets, but also posed risks. Hanging signs crafted from wood or iron swung above pedestrians' heads. In windy conditions, they could strike someone unexpectedly. To reduce such accidents, towns introduced rules requiring signs to be hung at certain heights or anchored with 2 chains instead of 1. Citizens learned to walk with awareness beneath them, mindful of breezes that might set a sign in motion. Steps leading into homes and shops were modified for safety as well. Instead of abrupt drops, some households built shallow steps that extended slightly into the lane. While reducing falling hazards, these steps altered the shape of the walkway. Pedestrians grew accustomed to navigating around them, much like one would avoid a planter or bench today. These projecting steps became resting points where someone might pause to adjust a basket or share news with a neighbor. One of the more subtle safety features was the deliberate placement of posts or stones at the edges of buildings. These boundary stones served multiple purposes. They protected walls from passing carts, guided pedestrians towards safer routes, and gave people a solid object to lean against during crowds. In icy conditions, these stones offered a firm point to steady one's footing. Their presence appears small, but in a world without guardrails, every stone mattered. Public wells and fountains, central to daily life, also prompted safety improvements. Water collectors created morning crowds around these sites. To prevent accidents, towns leveled the ground near wells, added raised borders around basins, or placed flat stones where water tended to spill. These adjustments kept footing more secure. Some communities installed simple wooden platforms near wells so people could rest their buckets without bending awkwardly. Such thoughtful touches reduced strain and prevented minor injuries from becoming serious ones. Bridges were another key part of street safety. Towns built small footbridges over drainage channels or streams running through settlements. These bridges varied widely in construction. Some were planks, others stone, others timber frames with handrails. Even the simplest bridge helped direct foot traffic safely over uneven or wet ground. Their presence encouraged predictable movement, reducing the number of people who waded through muddy channels where slipping was likely. Seasonal repairs reinforced safety. Each year, after the heavy rains or winter frosts, town officials and guild members worked together to restore damaged streets. Loose stones were reset, broken gutters were patched, uneven walkways were leveled. These seasonal efforts created a rhythm of upkeep. People recognized that their towns needed regular attention, and they respected the skills of craftsmen who kept pathways usable. Though medieval maintenance was limited by money and manpower, these periodic repairs significantly reduced street hazards. Architectural spacing also reflected safety thinking. In some towns, narrow alleys between buildings served as escape passages during fires or crowd surges. Their placement was partly accidental, shaped by old property boundaries, but towns learned to preserve them intentionally. These alleys offered relief spaces where pedestrians could step aside, avoiding carts or dense crowds. They also helped air flow through the town, preventing smoke and dust from settling heavily in main lanes. As towns grew, authorities experimented with more formal street planning. They widened certain main routes, especially those used by merchants. Wider lanes gave carts more room to maneuver, reducing collisions. In a few cases, towns resurfaced particular streets with better stones, recognizing that smoother roads decreased tripping hazards. These improvements often began in central squares and slowly expanded outward as resources allowed. Public instruction helped reinforce these safety practices. Town criers made announcements about road repairs, new walking guidelines, or temporary closures. Their voices carried through squares and markets, informing townsfolk of which paths to avoid and which newly improved routes were open. These announcements functioned as early traffic advisories, ensuring that people moved with greater awareness. The Bowler's measures worked together to create a kind of medieval harmony. Raised walkways lifted pedestrians above mud, gutters guided water away, curved corners softened intersections, boundary stones protected walls and people alike, hanging signs were secured, carts signaled their approach, and households maintained their small piece of the street. Each detail might seem small in isolation, yet their combined effect shaped safer daily movement. Above all, medieval street safety grew from cooperation. Townsfolk respected unwritten rules, responded to familiar signals, and adjusted their movements to accommodate one another. Architectural choices guided behavior, and behavior shaped architecture. Over time, this relationship created streets that were not perfect but functional, supporting the life of the community in every season. The medieval street, in the end, tells a story of people learning how to live together in tight spaces filled with constant activity. Their safety practices reveal resourcefulness rather than luxury. They used what they had, improved what they could, and passed down wisdom through daily habit. As we leave the medieval street and prepare to enter the next story, we carry with us the lessons of a world that grew safer, not through grand inventions, but through steady, shared effort. Medieval towns glowed with the warmth of hearths, the flicker of candles, and the ever-present risk of fire. To a modern observer, it may seem extraordinary that entire communities were built from wood, thatched roofs, and flammable materials, yet these streets and homes were the norm for centuries. Fire was not simply a danger, it was a constant companion, shaping behavior, architecture, and early safety practices. Understanding how people lived with this threat offers insight into the slow development of safety awareness in daily life. Most medieval homes were timber framed, a design that was practical, affordable, and adaptable, but alarmingly vulnerable. Wattle and daub filled the walls, providing insulation but also fuel for flames. Roofs of straw or reeds ignited easily. Even stone buildings were rarely entirely fireproof, as interior wooden beams and floors remained highly flammable. Kitchens, central to family life, posed the greatest risk. Open hearths were common, as enclosed stoves were rare, and controlling the heat of a large exposed fire required constant attention. Sparks escaped easily, whether from cooking fires or metalworking hearths, and could travel to walls, furniture, or curtains in a heartbeat. Cooking fires were both necessary and dangerous. Preparing bread, roasting meat, and boiling stews required sustained flames. Most homes lacked chimneys, so smoke escaped through small openings in the roof or gaps in the walls. Without a controlled pathway for heat and embers, sparks could fall onto straw bedding, wooden beams, or other combustible materials. Families developed careful routines to reduce the risk, keeping hearths surrounded by stone or brick, placing buckets of water or sand nearby, and training children to stay at a safe distance. Even with these precautions, the margin for error was slim. Nighttime posed special challenges. Uven fanavadics bias and absorb cording su and apps created overlapping light sources, each with its own risk of ignition. Families sometimes doused smaller flames before sleeping, leaving only embers behind. In wealthier homes, iron or clay hearths contained fires more securely. In simpler dwellings, embers smoldered in shallow pits, requiring constant vigilance. The potential for a stray ember to ignite the surrounding home was high, and even a small fire could quickly spread from one timbered structure to the next in crowded lanes. Marketplaces amplified fire hazards. Street vendors often cooked over open flames to sell food. Pots of boiling liquids, roasted meats, and flatbreads baked in portable hearths offered convenience and flavor, but also increased danger. Sparks might land on sacks of grain or straw mats, and nearby wooden carts provided additional fuel. Towns recognized the threat, and informal rules gradually emerged. Vendors learned to maintain minimal spacing between cooking fires and wooden structures. Some guilds offered guidance on safe fire management, while neighbors developed habits of careful observation, warning vendors when sparks threatened their homes. Storage practices added to the risk. Grain, straw, and firewood were stored near or within homes for convenience, particularly during winter. The close proximity of flammable materials created a tinderbox situation. People developed strategies to reduce risk, such as keeping straw piles away from hearths, stacking firewood with careful ventilation to prevent spontaneous combustion, and arranging grain stores in separate spaces when possible. These precautions required constant attention and discipline, especially in homes with multiple family members and children moving through crowded rooms. The architecture of the street itself contributed to fire spread. Timber overhangs, jettied upper floors, and narrow lanes created a continuous web of wood that connected one home to the next. Sparks or small flames could leap from roof to roof, and in crowded market quarters, fire might travel blocks in minutes. To combat this, towns introduced simple urban planning adjustments. Narrow alleys sometimes doubled as fire breaks. Some communities removed or replaced overhanging features when rebuilding after fires. Certain streets received wider spacing between buildings or paved surfaces to slow the advance of flames. These measures were primitive by modern standards, yet they reflected deliberate thought about fire safety. Household items themselves could be dangerous. Candles, rushlights, and lamps required careful handling. Wax or tallow dripped easily onto wooden floors. Cloth draped near a fire could ignite within seconds. People learned to secure fabrics, place lamps on stable surfaces, and carry flames with steady hands. This knowledge was passed from parents to children, forming a culture of constant awareness. Families treated fire with respect and vigilance, teaching that small negligence could have catastrophic consequences. Early fire suppression methods were simple but critical. Homes often kept buckets of water or sand on hand, ready to smother small fires before they grew. Nearby wells or fountains provided a backup, though hauling water could take precious minutes. Fire extinguishing knowledge was largely practical: smother flames, prevent oxygen from feeding the blaze, and stop sparks from traveling to nearby combustible materials. Despite the lack of modern equipment, these practices saved lives and prevented larger disasters. Towns took collective steps to reduce fire hazards. Watchtowers and watch posts were established in larger settlements, allowing town guards to observe rooftops for early signs of fire. The ringing of bells could alert neighbors to emerging danger. In some places, volunteer brigades of townsfolk formed, carrying ladders, buckets, and basic tools to fight fire collectively. These early firefighting measures were rudimentary, but symbolized an understanding that fire was not only an individual problem, but a communal one. Regulation began to take hold in response to repeated disasters. Some towns prohibited the use of particularly flammable roofing materials in dense quarters. Others issued rules regarding the location of hearths in homes and shops. Market stalls might be instructed to maintain a minimum distance from surrounding timber. Over time, these regulations formed the backbone of urban safety policy, demonstrating that experience and tragedy could be transformed into protective measures. Education about fire hazards was crucial. Guilds played a role in instructing apprentices not only in their trades, but in the responsible use of heat, flame, and embers. Parents incorporated fire safety into daily life, emphasizing careful handling of candles, proper maintenance of hearths, and recognition of early signs of combustion. This cultural knowledge spread slowly, but it created a shared understanding of risk and precaution. Even everyday habits reflected fire awareness. People avoided leaving cooking unattended, closed doors to prevent drafts from feeding flames, and arranged furniture to maintain a safe perimeter around open hearths. In winter, when indoor heating became essential, families balanced the need for warmth against the constant threat of ignition. These adjustments required patience, mindfulness, and attention to detail, a daily practice that shaped life in medieval homes. The danger of fire extended to celebrations and festivals. Torches, bonfires, and candles illuminated public events, but they also posed significant hazards in densely packed spaces. Town officials often positioned these flames strategically away from buildings and employed volunteers to monitor them. Fire became both a source of light and a focus of vigilance. People attended festivities with awareness, understanding that a single careless movement could spark a disaster. Through all of this, medieval people demonstrated remarkable adaptability. Fire was an ever-present risk, yet it did not paralyze them. They learned to respect flames, manage them carefully, and incorporate safety practices into the rhythms of daily life. From household arrangements to communal patrols, from guild instruction to urban regulation, safety evolved organically. It was neither comprehensive nor foolproof, but it reflected a deep understanding that vigilance and preparation could mitigate even the most destructive element in their environment. Now, we will explore how towns extended these early fire safety measures beyond individual homes into coordinated community efforts. Fire patrols, bucket brigades, and early regulations formed the basis for collective action, showing how medieval communities combined practical knowledge with organizational innovation to protect both property and life. In medieval towns, fire was a danger that could not be contained by individual effort alone. Homes, markets, workshops, and warehouses were tightly clustered, creating a situation where a single spark might ignite an entire street, neighborhood, or even an entire town. Over time, communities developed organized measures to prevent, detect, and suppress fires on a larger scale. These early strategies were modest compared to modern firefighting, yet they reflect the ingenuity and resilience of people living in timbered towns without modern equipment. One of the earliest communal responses was the establishment of watchtowers. Rising above crowded lanes, these towers provided a vantage point from which a guard could survey the roofs and streets below. Watchmen stationed in the towers were trained to recognize smoke, sparks, or flames quickly. Even a faint wisp of smoke rising from a distant roof could trigger immediate response, giving townspeople precious minutes to act before fire spread. Watchtowers were often placed strategically overlooking market squares, main thoroughfares, and the most densely built areas. Their presence alone served as a deterrent to careless fire use, reminding residents that vigilance was constant. Complementing the watchtowers were mobile patrols. Towns employed or relied upon volunteers to walk the streets during periods of high risk, such as evenings or festival nights. These patrols carried lanterns to illuminate dark lanes and small tools, such as buckets, hooks, or simple rakes, ready to intervene in minor flare-ups. Their duties included checking households for secure hearths, ensuring that fires in workshops were properly contained, and alerting neighbors to emerging hazards. While not full-time firefighters in the modern sense, these patrols embodied the principle that community vigilance could prevent disaster. The sound of bells played a critical role in fire prevention and alert. Many towns had designated bells, separate from church chimes, that were reserved for emergencies. When a fire was spotted, the watchman or patrolling volunteer would ring the bell in a particular rhythm, signaling residents to take action. People knew the meaning immediately: gather buckets, move livestock away, and prepare to contain the fire. Bells transmitted information quickly across the dense streets, functioning as an early form of emergency alert that relied entirely on human recognition and action. Buckets were the cornerstone of medieval firefighting. Often made of wood or leather, these buckets were kept in homes, taverns, guild halls, and market stalls. Residents formed bucket brigades, passing water from well or fountain to fire in an organized line. Coordination was essential. Each person had a role, whether filling the bucket, passing it along, or dousing the flames. While primitive compared to modern hoses and pumps, these brigades were surprisingly effective. They relied on speed, discipline, and cooperation, teaching townsfolk that collective action could overcome even a rapidly spreading fire. Community regulations gradually formalized these practices. Some towns required that each household maintain a minimum number of buckets and keep them filled. Others issued rules for the safe positioning of hearths and the storage of flammable materials. Market stalls were instructed to maintain a certain distance between cooking fires and timber structures. Violations could result in fines or other penalties, reflecting an early recognition that safety was not only personal but a civic duty. These regulations evolved over decades, adapting to the lessons learned from past fires. Training was subtle but present. Guilds educated their members not only in their craft but in fire management. Blacksmiths learned to handle sparks, potters maintained kilns with caution, and bakers kept their ovens under watchful eyes. Apprentices absorbed the techniques of their masters, passing practical knowledge down generations. This informal training extended beyond guilds. Families educated children about fire danger, emphasizing constant awareness and safe handling of flames. In this way, practical knowledge of fire safety became a cultural norm, ingrained in daily routines and understood intuitively by town residents. Early tools for firefighting included hooks, ladders, and simple beaters. Hooks were used to pull down thatch or other burning materials, creating small fire breaks or preventing embers from reaching neighboring buildings. Ladders allowed access to upper floors and roofs, facilitating extinguishing efforts and rescue of people or possessions. Beaters, long sticks with cloth or leather attached, were used to smother flames in smaller fires. Each tool required skill, coordination, and calm under pressure. Even with these simple implements, organized response could dramatically reduce damage. Street planning itself became an element of fire prevention. Some towns widened main thoroughfares to act as natural fire breaks. Open squares served not only as marketplaces, but as safety zones where people could gather and fires could be fought with more space. Alleys were preserved as escape routes, allowing residents to move away from spreading flames. Paving and drainage improvements also contributed, reducing the likelihood that dry debris or spilled liquids would fuel fire. Even small architectural adjustments played a role in reducing vulnerability. Fire prevention during festivals and public gatherings demanded additional attention. Torchlight processions, bonfires, and candles were integral to celebrations, but presented high risks. Communities responded by placing such flames in open areas away from wooden structures, assigning volunteers to monitor them, and instructing participants on safety practices. These measures reflected an understanding that the social and cultural importance of fire could coexist with careful management. Towns learned quickly from disaster. Recurrent fires prompted adjustments to regulations, architecture, and community habits. After a particularly destructive blaze, officials might mandate wider spacing between homes or prohibit certain types of roofing. Guilds might introduce more rigorous training for handling open flames. Residents internalized lessons through stories of past fires, reinforcing habits of vigilance. Knowledge accumulated slowly but steadily, creating a cultural memory of fire danger that persisted across generations. Fire also shaped social organization. Community cooperation, rather than hierarchy alone, became essential for survival. Bucket brigades, coordinated patrols, and neighborhood alert systems relied on trust and participation. The most effective towns were those in which each household understood its responsibilities and acted promptly when danger arose. Fire demanded both individual discipline and collective action. Neglect or hesitation by even a single household could compromise the efforts of many. Lighting practices were adjusted to reduce nighttime risk. Residents often used covered lanterns when moving through streets, minimizing the chance of igniting loose straw or thatch. Candles were placed in stone or metal holders rather than on wooden surfaces. Households extinguished known essential flames before retiring for the night, leaving only embers under supervision. These small adaptations, reinforced over time, represented a conscious effort to mitigate danger while maintaining daily routines. Even with these efforts, fire remained an omnipresent threat. Its unpredictable nature, combined with flammable materials, crowded streets, and variable weather, meant that accidents continued to occur. Yet the emergence of communal measures, watchtowers, patrols, bells, bucket brigades, regulations, and training transformed fire from an uncontrollable hazard into a manageable risk. Safety was never absolute, but it became a shared responsibility, ingrained in the rhythm of daily life and reinforced by generations of practical experience. The medieval response to fire exemplifies a key principle of survival in hazardous environments. Vigilance combined with community coordination can reduce harm even when technology is limited. Residents learn to respect fire, anticipate its dangers, and act quickly when needed. The lessons of medieval fire prevention echo beyond timber streets and open hearths, illustrating the power of awareness, cooperation, and adaptation. Now we will explore how communities organize training, bucket chains, early fire codes, and other preventive practices, showing the evolution from informal vigilance to structured, town-wide systems of fire management. By the late medieval period, towns had learned that fire could not be fully controlled by individual households or casual vigilance alone. The lessons of countless disasters, flames racing through timbered streets, entire neighborhoods reduced to ash, livelihoods lost in minutes, spurred communities to develop more organized systems. These systems combined physical tools, coordinated efforts, and cultural habits, creating the first recognizable forms of town-wide fire safety. At the heart of medieval fire prevention was the bucket brigade. Though simple, it relied on careful coordination, discipline, and community participation. Residents of a street or neighborhood formed a line stretching from a water source, often a well or fountain, to the location of a fire. Each person filled their bucket, passed it to the next individual, and repeated the cycle. The technique demanded rhythm and attention. Buckets could be heavy, particularly when made of wood or leather and filled with water, so participants learned to anticipate timing and maintain continuous movement without spilling. A well-organized brigade could suppress a fire that would have overwhelmed a single household, demonstrating the power of collective action. Preparation for bucket brigades extended beyond emergency moments. Homes were required to maintain a certain number of ready-filled buckets, often stored near accessible points. Towns sometimes designated assembly points where people could gather quickly when a bell rang. Volunteer lists were established in some towns, ensuring that every household knew its responsibilities. Even children were enlisted for simple tasks, such as carrying empty buckets back to the water source. The bucket brigade was both a practical response and a ritualized demonstration of shared civic responsibility. Complementing the bucket brigades were early fire codes. These regulations evolved gradually, often in response to repeated fires, Towns issued rules on roofing materials, prohibiting overly flammable thatch in densely built quarters, or requiring more robust coverings where fire risk was highest. Hearth placement was sometimes regulated, ensuring sufficient space between walls and open flames. Market stalls were restricted in their use of cooking fires, and proper storage of flammable materials was mandated. Though enforcement varied, these codes created a baseline expectation of behavior and built a culture in which neglect carried consequences. Guilds played an essential role in fire prevention and training. Blacksmiths, carpenters, bakers, and other trades used fire in their work daily, so guilds instructed apprentices in careful handling, safe distances from combustible materials, and methods to control sparks. These lessons were reinforced in workshops and homes, passing knowledge through generations. Guild regulations complemented town codes, providing trade-specific safeguards that acknowledged the realities of occupational hazards. In combination, town and guild guidance formed a layered system of preventative measures. Public infrastructure was adapted to support fire prevention. Watch posts and towers were connected to alarm systems using bells or horns. Streets were cleared of excessive debris, and storage areas for firewood, straw, and grain were located strategically to reduce risk to homes. Simple architectural adjustments, such as wider alleys or small open squares, were implemented to act as fire breaks. While modest, these interventions reflected a growing awareness of urban planning as a tool for safety. Nighttime vigilance remained critical. Fire hazards multiplied after dark due to candles, lamps, and residual embers from hearths. Watchmen patrolled the streets, observing for sparks or flames, while the sound of bells or horns could summon neighbors to assist. Households continued to extinguish unnecessary fires, secure flammable items, and maintain readiness with buckets at hand. These practices, passed from adult to child, reinforced the cultural norm that fire required continuous attention. Community drills were informal but impactful. Repeated exposure to drills, whether in preparation for a festival or a simulated fire event, trained residents to respond quickly and efficiently. People became familiar with their roles, routes, and tools, making real emergencies more manageable. Cooperation, coordination, and calm became skills honed over time, and townsfolk developed a shared confidence in their collective ability to respond. Education was not limited to the young again. Adults shared stories of past fires, recounting disasters to illustrate what could happen if rules were ignored. These oral histories reinforced vigilance and encouraged compliance with codes and communal practices. Knowledge was transmitted not only as instruction, but as narrative, embedding fire safety within the cultural memory of the town. This subtle educational approach ensured that precautions became intuitive rather than imposed. Fire prevention also shaped social behavior in public spaces. During fairs, markets, and religious celebrations, open flames were carefully managed. Torches were placed in open areas, bonfires were monitored by volunteers, and temporary stalls were arranged to minimize proximity to combustible structures. These practices demonstrated an understanding that safety was not simply a matter of personal responsibility, but also of managing shared risk in social spaces. Despite all efforts, fire could never be entirely prevented. Sparks escaped, embers traveled on the wind, and accidents continued to occur. Yet the combination of bucket brigades, watch posts, early fire codes, guild training, Public infrastructure and cultural habits significantly reduced the frequency and severity of disasters. Medieval communities learned that safety required both preparation and participation, blending human vigilance with practical tools and communal cooperation. Over time, these practices evolved into recognizable systems of fire management. Towns refined their patrol schedules, improved the placement of water sources, and formalized responsibilities for households and guilds. The culture of prevention became embedded in daily life, guiding how people built, cooked, stored materials, and moved through their streets. Fire, once an uncontrollable threat, became a manageable risk through collective action, simple technology, and constant awareness. In conclusion, the medieval response to fire demonstrates how communities adapted to persistent hazards without modern equipment. Bucket brigades, watchtowers, early codes, and cultural practices combined to create a layered approach to safety. Vigilance, coordination, and education were as important as physical tools, showing that even in a world of timber streets, open flames, and crowded markets, people developed effective strategies to protect life and property. The lessons of medieval fire prevention reveal both human ingenuity and the power of shared responsibility in shaping safer, more resilient communities. In medieval towns, water was both a necessity and a danger. Life depended on it for drinking, cooking, washing, and agriculture, yet it carried invisible hazards capable of causing disease and death. The infrastructure of medieval towns was rudimentary, relying on wells, streams, and open drains. While residents learned ways to reduce risk, the challenge of keeping water clean was enormous. Understanding these struggles reveals how communities slowly developed early forms of sanitation and water management, long before modern plumbing or public health systems existed. Most towns drew their drinking water from wells. Some were simple hand-dug shafts lined with stone or timber. Others were deeper, with more elaborate masonry to prevent collapse. Wells were central to public life. Families, merchants, and travelers relied on them daily. In larger towns, wells were sometimes located in the center of a square or market, making them convenient for the greatest number of people. Yet these wells were also vulnerable. Contamination could occur when animal waste, runoff from streets, or decomposing organic material seeped into the ground nearby. Even wells that appeared clean could harbor harmful bacteria, though medieval people did not understand germs in the way we do today. To protect wells, towns implemented simple precautions. Some built stone or timber covers to prevent debris from falling in. Others raised the surrounding ground to prevent water from nearby drains flowing directly into the shaft. Communities occasionally dug wells at a distance from latrines, stables, or markets to reduce contamination. Even these modest measures significantly lowered the risk of waterborne illness, though accidents and lapses were common. Residents quickly learned that a well near waste could make families sick for weeks, reinforcing the importance of careful placement. Open drains were both practical and hazardous. Streets often sloped toward a central channel that carried rainwater and household waste away. These channels prevented flooding in homes, but carried all manner of filth, organic waste, animal droppings, and wastewater flowed openly, often mingling with areas used for walking or washing. Children played near these drains, pets roamed freely, and livestock might drink from stagnant puddles. The danger of infection was constant. People relied on observation and experience to judge which water was safe. Clear, flowing water was preferred, while stagnant pools were avoided whenever possible. Bridges and stepping stones were sometimes placed over drains to facilitate safer passage. These simple structures allowed pedestrians to cross without stepping into contaminated water, reducing contact with waste. In some towns, officials reinforced these crossings with stone or timber platforms to ensure stability. Even minor improvements like these made streets safer and helped prevent minor accidents, particularly for women and children carrying buckets or goods. Water storage in homes and workshops posed additional challenges. Barrels, clay jars, or wooden buckets were used to keep water for cooking, washing, or drinking. These containers had to be kept clean and covered to prevent contamination. Families discovered through experience that standing water could develop unpleasant odors, attract insects, or become dangerous to drink. Simple cleaning routines, such as rinsing containers and changing water regularly, became cultural norms. Knowledge of safe storage passed from parents to children, forming a practical education in hygiene long before the concept of microbiology existed. The location of latrines and privies was crucial for sanitation. Towns attempted to separate human waste from water sources, though space constraints often limited options. Some towns built latrines over flowing rivers or in areas where waste could be carried away naturally. Others constructed simple pits or vaults a safe distance from wells and homes. Maintenance of these latrines was essential. When pits filled or overflowed, contamination spread rapidly. Townsfolk learned to monitor the condition of public facilities and report problems to authorities, creating a culture of shared responsibility for hygiene. Communities developed routines to manage these hazards. Residents often boiled water for drinking or cooking when possible, although fuel constraints limited the practice. Boiling was used particularly for infants, the sick, or the elderly. Certain herbal infusions were also believed to purify water or protect against illness, demonstrating early attempts at chemical or biological control through observation and tradition. While not entirely effective, these practices reflect a sophisticated understanding that not all water sources were equally safe. Public fountains, often built from stone, served as central collection points. They were easier to maintain than small household wells because their design allowed for some protection from debris. Stone channels guided water into basins, and elevated outlets prevented contamination from splashes or animals. Communities occasionally organized maintenance efforts to clean fountains, remove debris, and ensure that the water flow remained steady. These early public works demonstrated the value of communal action for the benefit of all. Rainwater collection offered another solution. Residents placed barrels, cisterns, or simple containers under eaves to gather fresh water. This water was often considered safer for household use, as it avoided direct contamination from streets or wells. Proper storage remained essential, and people learned to cover collection containers to prevent insects, debris, or small animals from entering. Rainwater harvesting illustrates the creative strategies medieval communities employed to supplement limited clean water supplies. Rivers and streams were both vital and risky. They provided drinking water, bathing locations, irrigation for gardens, and sites for industrial activities such as dyeing, tanning, and milling. At the same time, Rivers carried waste from upstream settlements, livestock, and occasional corpses. People learned to use rivers cautiously, selecting particular areas for washing or drawing water, while avoiding others that seemed dirty or stagnant. Observation, smell, and local knowledge guided these decisions, creating a practical system of water management long before modern testing methods. Education played a critical role. Parents taught children to recognize clean water, avoid stagnant pools, and use specific sources for drinking versus washing. Guilds instructed apprentices on proper use of water in trades, emphasizing both efficiency and hygiene. Towns sometimes posted reminders near wells or fountains, warning against contamination or improper disposal of waste. Through repeated instruction, cultural habits emerged that emphasized caution, observation, and communal responsibility. The social consequences of water contamination were severe. Disease could spread rapidly, causing localized epidemics that disrupted markets, labor, and family life. Towns that neglected sanitation paid a high price. In contrast, communities that maintained wells, drains, and public fountains effectively reduced illness, allowing residents to work, trade, and thrive. These practical lessons reinforced the value of sanitation and water management, embedding them in both urban planning and daily behavior. Even the layout of streets reflected awareness of water hazards. Streets were designed to slope naturally, directing water and waste away from homes and marketplaces. Where possible, gutters or channels were lined with stone or timber to improve drainage and prevent stagnation. Elevated walkways and bridges complemented this system, reducing pedestrian contact with contaminated water. Architecture and urban design were intertwined with health practices, demonstrating the early recognition that environment and behavior together influenced well-being. In conclusion, medieval water and sanitation systems were rudimentary but essential. Wells, fountains, open drains, and rivers provided life-sustaining resources while simultaneously posing risks. Through careful observation, practical routines, community cooperation, and early regulation, towns developed ways to manage these hazards. Safety depended on vigilance, habit, and shared knowledge, showing that even in a world without modern science, people understood the importance of protecting their most vital resource. Water was not only a daily necessity, but also a vector for invisible danger. In medieval towns, contaminated water contributed to illness and epidemic disease. Residents often linked sickness to miasmas, foul smells, or visible filth, rather than understanding microscopic germs. Nevertheless, observation and experience gradually produced practices that mitigated risk. Townsfolk learned which water sources were safer, how to store water, and how to reduce exposure to stagnant pools, forming the foundation of early public health measures. One of the most serious threats was contaminated wells. Wells that drew water from shallow or polluted ground often carried bacteria or parasites, resulting in fevers, dysentery, or other illnesses. People quickly associated illness with particular sources. Over time, they avoided certain wells, dug new ones, or constructed protective coverings. In some towns, wealthier households dug private wells to reduce reliance on shared, potentially contaminated public sources. This informal knowledge of risk shaped both daily behavior and urban development. Open drains presented a constant hazard. Waste, runoff, and standing water mingled freely in streets, creating ideal conditions for disease spread. During wet seasons, drainage channels could overflow, spilling filth onto walkways. Towns experimented with lining drains with timber, stone, or clay to improve flow and reduce standing water. Even minor improvements decreased direct contact with contaminated liquid, demonstrating how practical engineering evolved alongside cultural practices to protect public health. Epidemics highlighted the stakes. Outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, or cholera-like illnesses swept through towns quickly. High population density, contaminated water, and poor sanitation allowed disease to move from home to home. In response, communities sometimes instituted simple quarantine measures, isolating the sick or relocating households temporarily. Public wells or fountains might be closed or guarded to prevent use by the ill. While rudimentary, these strategies show that medieval people recognized a connection between contaminated water and illness, even if the exact cause was unknown. Bathing and washing were also affected. Rivers, streams, and public baths provided essential hygiene, yet they could be contaminated with human or animal waste. Residents learned to avoid certain areas, to boil water before washing wounds, and to restrict the use of shared water for drinking. These habits reduced the risk of disease and formed a practical understanding of hygiene long before germ theory. Observation, experimentation, and shared experience guided behavior more than written law or scientific knowledge. Town authorities began to introduce public health regulations. These included rules about waste disposal, drainage maintenance, and the location of latrines relative to wells. Officials might mandate that streets remain clear of refuse, that animal pens be kept away from public thoroughfares, or that households cover wells. Though enforcement varied, the regulations created shared expectations. Compliance was reinforced socially. Neighbors reported unsafe practices, guilds monitored apprentices, and collective vigilance became a form of accountability. Education reinforced these measures. Parents instructed children to avoid contaminated water, to wash hands after handling waste, and to use designated latrines. Guilds incorporated hygiene guidance into training, particularly in trades involving food preparation or water use. Stories of past epidemics served as warnings, illustrating the consequences of neglect and the benefits of careful water management. Knowledge became cultural, embedded in daily routines, and reinforced by repetition. Infrastructure improvements supported safer water use. Elevated fountains, stone channels, and protective well covers minimized contamination. Some towns dug cisterns or storage barrels to collect rainwater, providing a secondary, relatively safer supply. Streets were graded to facilitate drainage, and bridges or stepping stones kept pedestrians above contaminated flow. Even minor architectural changes significantly improved public safety. Observation and record keeping played a role. While medieval towns did not maintain detailed health statistics, anecdotal knowledge about which wells or fountains caused illness informed communal behavior. Citizens remembered which areas were safer and avoided sources associated with disease. These collective memories guided urban planning and influenced the location of new water sources, demonstrating an early form of risk assessment. Food preparation was closely tied to water safety. Households boiled water when possible, used fresh running water for washing vegetables, and prioritized safe sources for infants or the sick. Markets emphasized cleanliness by avoiding direct contact between water used for washing and consumable goods. These habits, reinforced daily, became a form of early preventive medicine, reducing the likelihood of outbreaks even when full understanding of pathogens was lacking. Public behavior adapted as well. People avoided stagnant pools, covered open containers, and maintained household cleanliness. Community norms discouraged throwing waste into streets or near water sources. Social pressure, reinforced through guilds, neighbors, and family instruction, encouraged compliance. Even without formal enforcement, these behavioral norms became effective in managing waterborne risk. In addition to practical measures, observation of seasonal patterns influenced precautions. During rainy seasons, when runoff and flooding increased, towns heightened vigilance around wells and drains. Residents prepared extra buckets for cleaning. Elevated walkways were reinforced, and temporary drainage channels were dug. Seasonal awareness became part of the rhythm of life, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of environmental factors affecting health. By combining observation, regulation, infrastructure, and cultural habits, medieval towns slowly mitigated the dangers of contaminated water. While disease remained a persistent threat, communities reduced exposure through practical, coordinated efforts. Safety was not absolute, yet these strategies represent an early adaptive form of public health, blending experience, cooperation, and environmental management in the absence of scientific understanding. Now we will explore the development of more systematic water management, including sewer systems, community maintenance efforts, and strategies for managing livestock and human waste, revealing how towns gradually created safer, cleaner living environments. By the later medieval period, towns increasingly recognized that water safety required more than careful well use and cautious behavior. The accumulation of waste, both human and animal, posed constant threats to health. Communities responded by developing rudimentary sewer systems, regulating waste disposal, and creating maintenance routines, demonstrating that shared infrastructure and coordinated action could reduce risk even in a dense urban environment. Early sewer systems were simple but effective within the limitations of the time. Stone or timber channels carried rainwater and household waste from streets and homes toward rivers or open ditches outside town boundaries. These channels were often uncovered, allowing easy access for cleaning, but also permitting contact with pedestrians. Some towns added stone slabs or wooden planks to form pedestrian walkways above the flow. While basic, these systems reflected the principle of separating moving water and waste from foot traffic, illustrating early urban planning for public health. Maintenance of these sewers relied heavily on community labor. Guilds, municipal workers, and householders all contributed to cleaning debris, removing silt, and repairing damaged channels. During certain seasons, coordinated efforts ensured that drains flowed freely and reduced the risk of flooding or overflow, which could spread contamination through streets and homes. Participation in these activities was seen as both civic duty and practical necessity, emphasizing collective responsibility for sanitation. Waste disposal regulations began to emerge as towns grew more aware of contamination hazards. Authorities restricted dumping of refuse into streets or near water sources. Livestock was kept in designated pens to prevent droppings from mixing with pedestrian pathways or wells. Public latrines were strategically located to minimize contamination of drinking water and were sometimes maintained by appointed attendants. Enforcement varied, but social pressure, fines, and guild oversight encouraged compliance, embedding the importance of proper waste management into daily life. Household practices complemented community measures. Families learned to dispose of waste in designated areas, cover latrine pits, and avoid contaminating wells. Night soil collectors sometimes removed human waste for use in agriculture outside town, creating a practical method of recycling while reducing risk in urban spaces. These combined efforts illustrate the interdependence of private diligence and communal infrastructure in achieving basic sanitation. Drainage and street design evolved to support these practices. Streets were graded to carry water and waste towards sewers or rivers, reducing puddling and stagnation. Raised walkways kept pedestrians above contaminated flow. Stone or timber linings reinforced channels to prevent erosion and accidental collapse. These measures reduced direct exposure to pathogens, even though the understanding of disease causation was limited. Trial, observation, and accumulated experience guided these incremental improvements. Public fountains and wells were also integrated into broader sanitation strategies. Elevated basins, protective covers, and careful placement reduced contamination from runoff and debris. Regular cleaning was often organized by municipal authorities or guilds, ensuring a dependable source of relatively safe water. Residents learned to distinguish between flowing, clear water and stagnant or foul-smelling sources, developing practical criteria for water use. Experience guided behavior as much as any formal instruction. Livestock management was an essential part of urban sanitation. Horses, cattle, and pigs were ubiquitous in towns, providing transport, labor, and food. Their waste presented a constant hazard if left in streets or near wells. Towns designated areas for animals, regulated their movement during markets, and instructed handlers to remove droppings promptly. These efforts reduced the likelihood of contamination reaching humans, demonstrating awareness of the environmental connections between animals and public health. Education and culture reinforced sanitation practices. Parents taught children to use designated latrines, avoid stagnant water, and respect waste disposal rules. Guilds incorporated hygiene principles into apprenticeships, particularly for trades involving food or water. Storytelling and community memory of past epidemics served as powerful reminders of the consequences of negligence. Knowledge became ingrained, forming habits that protected individuals and the community alike. Even festivals and public gatherings required careful attention. Temporary structures and market stalls were arranged to minimize interaction with drains, latrines, and contaminated areas. Water used for washing or food preparation was carefully managed, and public fountains were maintained to prevent accidental pollution. These practices illustrate a sophisticated, adaptive approach to balancing social activity with sanitation. Despite the challenges, medieval towns achieved incremental progress. Regular maintenance, regulated waste disposal, thoughtful street design, and community education reduced the most immediate hazards of waterborne disease. While epidemics still occurred and understanding of infection was incomplete, these measures reflect an early practical form of urban public health. Residents learned that sanitation depended on both infrastructure and behavior, creating a culture of vigilance and shared responsibility. By the end of this section, it becomes clear that the medieval approach to water and sanitation relied on observation, coordination, and practical problem solving. Sewers, drains, wells, fountains, and waste management practices combined to create a layered system of protection. Individuals maintained personal diligence, families instilled habits of caution, and communities organized collectively. Through these efforts, towns gradually transformed dangerous, contaminated environments into more manageable spaces, setting the stage for further advancements in urban safety and public health. The story of medieval sanitation teaches an enduring lesson, even in the absence of modern science. Careful observation, practical intervention, and communal cooperation can significantly reduce risk. While medieval towns remained vulnerable by modern standards, their adaptive strategies laid the foundation for safer, healthier urban life, demonstrating the human capacity to innovate and organize in the face of persistent danger. Medieval dining was a delicate balance between necessity, flavor, and hazard. While people enjoyed hearty breads, roasted meats, and seasonal vegetables, the methods used to preserve and season food often introduced unseen dangers, from imported spices to homemade preservatives. Early cooks navigated a world where culinary practice could both sustain life and threaten it. In this section, we explore how medieval food preparation carried hidden risks, shaping behavior and influencing safety innovations over time. Spices were prized commodities, both for flavor and for status. Pepper, saffron, cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg arrived from distant lands at great expense. Wealthy households used them liberally to display wealth and enhance flavor, while poorer families often went without. Yet spices were not always benign. Imported powders could be adulterated with fillers or contaminated during transport. Storage was a constant concern. Spices were kept in wooden boxes, ceramic jars, or small leather pouches, all of which were susceptible to moisture, pests, and mold. Dampness could promote fungal growth, rendering the spice both unpleasant and potentially harmful. Awareness of these risks led cooks to inspect spices carefully, shake out debris, and sometimes roast powders lightly before use. Salt, essential for preserving meats and fish, carried its own hazards. Brining and salting slowed decay, but poorly handled salt could introduce contamination. Barrels might be reused without thorough cleaning, exposing fresh food to residues of spoilage or waste. Salted meats were often stored for months, creating opportunities for bacterial or fungal growth. People learned through experience to smell, taste cautiously, and discard any meat showing signs of spoilage. This practice became an informal system of quality control, passed from generation to generation. Preservation methods varied widely. Smoking, pickling, drying, and fermenting were common strategies. Smoking meat over open fires imparted flavor and extended shelf life, yet required careful attention to temperature. Too little heat left meat partially preserved and prone to rot, while excessive heat could char food or release harmful compounds. Pickled foods relied on vinegar or brine. Vinegar, when properly prepared, acted as a mild preservative, yet inconsistent acidity or contaminated water could render pickled items unsafe. Fermentation of vegetables or dairy carried similar risks. The beneficial acids had to develop correctly to prevent spoilage. Medieval cooks learned these techniques primarily through trial and error, guided by smell, appearance, and texture. Food coloring and decorative ingredients introduced subtle dangers. Saffron, red lid-based pigments, and other additives were used to enhance appearance, particularly in feast settings. While saffron was generally safe in small amounts, lid-based colorants could cause chronic poisoning. Wealthy households that relied on visually striking foods sometimes faced gradual health consequences. These dangers were poorly understood at the time, and people relied on careful sourcing, reputation of merchants, and cautious use to reduce risk. Cooking vessels themselves could be hazardous. Pots made from tin, lead, or copper provided essential tools for boiling, roasting, and stewing. However, prolonged cooking with acidic foods in lead or copper vessels could leach harmful metals into the meal. Acidic ingredients like vinegar, wine, or fruit increased this risk. Observant cooks learned to avoid certain combinations, line pots with safer materials, or rotate utensils to minimize exposure. These practices, though empirical, reflected a sophisticated awareness of cause and effect in food preparation. Market conditions influenced risk significantly. Urban markets were crowded, and food was often displayed openly. Meat, fish, and dairy might sit for hours in the sun, attracting flies and insects. Buyers had to inspect goods carefully, looking for freshness, color, and odor. Some markets introduced rudimentary regulations, requiring sellers to cover food or rotate stock. Wealthy patrons often relied on personal kitchens with controlled storage to reduce exposure, while poorer residents relied on immediate consumption and careful selection from vendors. Honey and sweeteners presented both benefit and hazard. Honey acted as a preservative and a source of sugar, yet improperly stored honey could ferment, creating unpleasant or mildly harmful effects. Syrups and sugarcane products imported from distant regions were often contaminated with debris, adulterated with cheaper ingredients, or exposed to spoilage during transit. Households that relied on these items learned to test texture, clarity, and aroma before incorporating them into recipes. Dairy products were among the riskiest foods. Milk, butter, and cheese were highly perishable. Milk left at room temperature quickly developed sourness and could harbor pathogens. Cheese was often salted and aged to reduce spoilage, but improper handling or storage could still result in dangerous bacteria growth. People developed strategies to mitigate risk, boiling milk, using freshly made cheese quickly, or fermenting dairy in controlled environments. Cultural knowledge of dairy safety was extensive, though far from foolproof. Social habits shaped exposure to these dangers. Meals were communal, and sharing food carried both pleasure and risk. Families and neighbors relied on trust, selecting vendors and cooks with reputations for safe handling. Guests often ate cautiously when visiting unfamiliar households, observing food quality, preparation, and storage practices. Social memory reinforced caution. Tales of spoiled feasts, illness from contaminated fish, or fatal indulgence in improperly prepared sweets became lessons embedded in local culture. Environmental factors further influenced food safety. Seasonal variation affected availability, spoilage rates, and preservation methods. Hot summers accelerated decay, while cold winters allowed longer storage but created other logistical challenges. Rain, humidity, and proximity to water sources affected the risk of contamination in markets and kitchens. Observant households adjusted practices according to season developing a nuanced understanding of how environment, preparation, and storage intersected to determine safety. In conclusion, medieval dining involved constant negotiation between nourishment, flavor, and risk, spices, preservatives, cooking vessels, and market conditions all carried hidden dangers. People mitigated these risks through observation, experience, and cultural knowledge, developing practical strategies for inspection, preparation, and storage. Awareness of danger became woven into the rhythm of daily meals, demonstrating a sophisticated empirical approach to food safety long before the advent of scientific food hygiene. In medieval towns, beverages were as risky as solid foods. Water was often unsafe, so people relied heavily on beer, ale, wine, and other fermented drinks. These beverages served multiple purposes: hydration, nutrition, and sometimes mild intoxication. Yet fermentation, storage, and adulteration introduced dangers that could make a drink deadly, or at least harmful. Understanding these risks reveals how medieval households adapted to uncertainty and how cultural practices evolved to protect health. Ale and beer were staples, consumed by people of all ages. Brewing was typically done at home or in small local breweries. The fermentation process naturally killed some pathogens, making these beverages safer than water, but the quality varied widely. Over-fermented or improperly stored, ale could sour excessively, producing off flavors and stomach irritation. Containers made from wood, often reused and poorly cleaned, introduced the risk of contamination with bacteria or fungi. Experienced brewers learned to monitor fermentation, taste cautiously, and discard batches that showed signs of spoilage. Knowledge of safe brewing was often passed from parent to child or master to apprentice. Wine was more common in wealthier households, imported from Mediterranean regions, or produced locally in favorable climates. Wine brought both benefits and risks. Spoilage was less common due to higher alcohol content, yet transport and storage introduced potential hazards. Wooden barrels could harbor mold or insects, while long shipping routes exposed wine to contamination. Some merchants added substances such as resin, lead-based sweeteners, or spices to preserve or enhance flavor. These additives could be mildly toxic or produce chronic health effects. Cooks and tavern keepers developed empirical rules for safe consumption, carefully tasting, storing, and rotating stock to minimize risk. Fermented fruit drinks, meads, and ciders added variety, but carried similar dangers. Sugars and natural yeasts could produce unpredictable fermentation rates. Improperly sealed containers allowed oxidation or microbial growth, resulting in off flavors, mild intoxication, or gastrointestinal distress. People developed sensory tests, smell, clarity, and taste, to determine safety before consumption. Households learned to discard suspicious batches, an early form of risk management based on observation and experience. The tools of brewing also posed hidden threats. Lead or copper vessels could leach metals during fermentation, particularly when acidic fruits or wine were used. Brewers recognized that some recipes or container materials produced unpleasant or harmful effects, even if the mechanism was unknown. Over time, safer materials were preferred for critical stages of fermentation, while decorative or secondary containers might be used for storage or serving. These empirical adjustments reflect medieval experimentation and caution in handling liquids intended for consumption. Taverns and public drinking establishments created additional challenges. Large quantities of beverages were prepared and stored for daily sale. Wooden barrels could sit in warm cellars for extended periods, encouraging spoilage or contamination. Patrons often consumed drinks without knowledge of preparation quality, relying on trust in the tavern keeper. This reliance created informal reputational systems. Houses known for safe, well-prepared drinks attracted more customers, while establishments associated with sickness were avoided. Social observation thus reinforced safe drinking habits. Alcohol consumption intersected with nutrition and hygiene. Beer and ale provided calories and hydration, especially for laborers whose diets were limited. Even spoiled beverages were sometimes tolerated if the taste was mildly sour, but not dangerous, as the fermentation process provided some protection against harmful microorganisms in water. People developed subtle judgment skills to distinguish safe from unsafe beverages, balancing risk with necessity. These skills were critical in an environment where unsafe water was common and alternatives limited. Household hygiene played a role in beverage safety. Buckets, barrels, and jugs used for water or brewing were cleaned regularly. Residual waste, sediment, or foam was removed to prevent bacterial growth. Skilled brewers and cooks monitored fermentation temperatures and sealed containers appropriately. Awareness of seasonal and environmental factors, temperature fluctuations, humidity, or sunlight guided these practices. Observation and adaptation became core components of managing beverage safety. Even celebratory and medicinal uses of alcohol carried risk. Wines infused with herbs or spices were used as remedies for digestion, headaches, or fatigue. While some herbs had mild benefits, others could be toxic if misused. Dosage, preparation, and ingredient selection required careful attention. Medieval households developed practical rules for medicinal beverages, often informed by apprenticeships, oral tradition, or learned advice from local healers. Children and vulnerable family members were sometimes given weak ale or diluted wine, both as a safer alternative to water and as a mild nutritional supplement. Medics relied on similar empirical knowledge to prevent accidental overconsumption or exposure to harmful additives. Social norms guided these practices, ensuring that even risky beverages were consumed with caution in daily life. Through careful observation, experience, and social learning, medieval households mitigated many of the hidden dangers in drinking habits. Fermentation, storage, vessel material, and additives were all potential hazards, yet people developed practical strategies to manage risk. Knowledge passed through families, guilds, and communities shaped consumption patterns and encouraged vigilance, illustrating how daily life adapted to invisible threats in the absence of modern chemistry or microbiology. Now we will explore the interplay between food and drink, poisoning risks in feasts, regulatory attempts to prevent foodborne illness, and the ways households protected themselves through preparation, observation, and cultural practice, showing how medieval communities navigated dining hazards with practical ingenuity. Feasts in medieval times were social and political events, showcasing wealth, hospitality, and culinary skill. Yet these gatherings also magnified the hidden dangers of food and drink. Large quantities of ingredients, complex preparation, and multiple cooks increased the risk of spoilage or accidental poisoning. While some hazards were accidental, the fear of intentional poisoning shaped dining practices and prompted early regulatory efforts to protect participants. At the heart of feast safety was careful ingredient selection. Spices, meats, dairy, and preserved foods were inspected meticulously. Hosts often relied on trusted merchants and family networks to supply high-quality ingredients. Experience taught them that certain batches of imported spices could harbor contaminants. Improperly salted meats could harbor harmful microbes, and vegetables stored too long might rot silently. The scrutiny reflected practical risk management, balancing extravagance with caution to prevent illness or social embarrassment. Preparation posed another challenge. Feasts required large-scale cooking, often with multiple kitchens, staff, and overlapping processes. Cooking vessels varied widely, including tin, copper, and iron pots. Improper handling of acidic or highly seasoned foods could leach toxic metals, while inconsistent heat might fail to destroy harmful microorganisms. Skilled cooks learned to monitor temperatures, timing, and ingredient combinations carefully. Apprentices and assistants were trained to maintain hygiene and observe for signs of spoilage, forming a hierarchy of responsibility designed to minimize risk in complex operations. Food presentation and garnishing carried subtle hazards. Dyes, glazes, and decorative powders added beauty, but occasionally included harmful substances. Lead-based pigments, toxic minerals, or adulterated spices could be accidentally consumed. Hosts relied on trusted cooks and careful inspection to avoid dangerous ingredients. Over time, knowledge of safe decoration became part of culinary tradition, blending aesthetics with practical caution. Feasts also reinforced social vigilance. Guests were wary of unfamiliar dishes or beverages, particularly in politically charged settings. Observation of others' reactions, careful tasting, and moderation became important survival strategies. Hosts aware of the dangers often demonstrated transparency, serving certain foods first for inspection, or offering trusted beverages before others. Reputation and trust were crucial, influencing dining behavior, hospitality norms, and interpersonal relations. Intentional poisoning was a real concern, though not ubiquitous. Medieval texts record instances where food and drink were used as tools of intrigue, revenge, or assassination. This threat prompted layered safety measures. Trusted attendants monitored kitchens. Specific dishes were tasted first by servants or family members, and seating arrangements were sometimes planned to minimize risk. These practices reveal how social, political, and culinary considerations intertwined in risk management, reinforcing vigilance and structured oversight. Household routines supported everyday safety alongside extraordinary precautions. Regular cleaning of cooking vessels, storage containers, and pantry areas prevented contamination. Spoiled ingredients were discarded promptly, while preserved foods were rotated to ensure freshness. Experience-guided decision-making, smell, texture, appearance, and taste were all used as indicators of safety. These habits, learned over years and passed through generations, formed an empirical system of food hygiene. Community and regulatory oversight complemented household measures. Guilds issued guidance for professional cooks, emphasizing safe handling of meats, spices, and beverages. Markets imposed rules on vendors to reduce exposure to spoiled or adulterated goods. Town ordinances sometimes regulated ingredient quality, preparation methods, and storage conditions. Compliance was reinforced socially through reputation, observation, and communal accountability, creating a layered system of protection. Education, storytelling, and cultural memory played critical roles. Tales of feasts gone awry, accidental poisonings, or foodborne illness served as cautionary lessons. Apprentices, children, and young household members learned not only recipes, but also techniques for risk avoidance. Knowledge became embedded in practice. What might have been a life-threatening mistake in one generation became a standard precaution in the next. Environmental factors further influenced risk. Hot weather accelerated spoilage. Rainfall could contaminate open markets, and transportation of ingredients from distant regions increased exposure to harmful substances. Households adapted by adjusting storage, using protective coverings, boiling water and milk, and limiting consumption of high-risk foods. Observation, experience, and adaptation became continuous parts of daily life. In conclusion, medieval feasts illustrate the intersection of culinary art, social practice, and risk management. Hosts and guests navigated hidden dangers through inspection, careful preparation, social vigilance, and cultural habits. The fear of accidental or intentional poisoning led to practical strategies that emphasized trust, observation, and hygiene. Over time, these practices became normalized, forming an intricate system of food safety that allowed communities to celebrate, socialize, and nourish themselves, even amidst invisible hazards. The culture of caution in medieval dining highlights the ingenuity and attentiveness that underpinned survival in an era where food could sustain life or ended unexpectedly. In medieval life, tools were essential for survival, work, and household tasks. From farm implements to kitchen knives, hammers, and mills, everyday life demanded constant interaction with potentially dangerous equipment. Unlike modern tools with standardized safety features, medieval implements relied on skill, attention, and experience to prevent injury. For ordinary people, a moment's lapse in concentration could mean a serious wound, permanent disability, or even death. This section explores the ever-present dangers of tools and machinery in the medieval world and the practical strategies developed to mitigate those risks. Hand tools were ubiquitous in both domestic and professional settings. Axes, knives, scythes, hammers, and chisels formed the backbone of farming, construction, carpentry, and household chores. Each tool carried inherent danger. An axe could slip while chopping wood, a knife could cut deeply while preparing food, and a hammer could crush fingers when striking nails or chisels. Mastery of these tools required repeated practice, steady hands, and careful attention to posture and technique. Apprenticeships and family instruction were the primary methods of skill transmission, allowing young people to learn both efficiency and safety. Sharpening tools presented another set of hazards. Blades needed to be kept keen to function properly, but the act of sharpening could result in serious injury if attention wavered. Stones, files, and whetstones required stable placement and controlled motion. Improper sharpening could damage the tool, create unpredictable edges, or send sparks flying. Households and workshops developed routines for safe sharpening, often assigning experienced individuals to the task and teaching apprentices how to maintain correct angles and steady pressure. This training was not only practical, but vital for survival. Mills and other mechanical devices were particularly hazardous. Water mills, windmills, and hand-crank mills used moving gears, heavy stones, and complex mechanisms. While essential for grinding grain and other labor-intensive processes, they could trap clothing, hair, or limbs with devastating consequences. Operators needed precise timing, constant attention, and strict discipline. Families and guilds emphasized clear communication. One person supervised the mechanism, while another managed the input of grain or wood. Accidents often prompted revisions to technique, positioning, and coordination, creating informal safety protocols in the absence of modern engineering standards. Domestic chores carried hidden dangers as well. Cooking over open hearths, handling heavy cauldrons, and chopping vegetables or firewood exposed household members to burns, cuts, and crushing injuries. Kitchens often lacked counters, tables, or secure storage, increasing the risk of slips, trips, and accidental contact with sharp objects. Experience and observation guided the placement of tools and work routines. Children were taught from an early age which tasks were safe for their age and skill level, and which required adult supervision. Livestock handling compounded these risks. Animals were necessary for labor, food, and transportation, yet could kick, bite, or crush people during daily chores. Farmers used ropes, halters, and fences to manage animals, but a startled horse or ox could cause serious injury. Experience, careful observation, and constant attention became essential survival skills, forming part of a broader culture of vigilance in rural and urban life alike. Market and workshop life amplified hazards. Merchants and craftsmen worked with sharp instruments, open flames, and heavy materials, often in crowded conditions. Shops were small, floors uneven, and lighting poor, especially in winter months. Guilds provided informal training in safe tool use, emphasizing posture, proper handling, and coordination in shared spaces. Apprentices learned not only technique, but also situational awareness, developing an intuitive sense of how to navigate high-risk environments. Emergency response was ad hoc but practical. Families and workshops kept simple remedies for minor injuries, bandages, herbal poultices, and compresses made from cloth or plant materials. Knowledge of these treatments was passed orally, and experience with small injuries reinforced awareness of what could go wrong with sharp tools or moving machinery. Even these basic measures reflected a proactive approach to everyday hazards. Time of day and attention to fatigue influenced safety. People recognized that tired hands, blurred vision, or distraction increased the likelihood of accidents. Skilled workers often timed critical tasks for periods of alertness, ensuring that dangerous activities like chopping wood, operating mills, or using sharp knives occurred when focus was optimal. Cultural understanding of human limitations thus contributed to practical risk management. Seasonal factors also played a role. Winter introduced icy surfaces, cold hands, and brittle materials, increasing the risk of slips and breakage. Summer heat could sap strength and cause inattentiveness during repetitive tasks. Experience-guided adaptation, gloves, wedges, and other simple tools were used to improve grip and stability, while work schedules were adjusted to reduce accidents. These practical adjustments highlight the empirical knowledge embedded in daily routines. Social observation reinforced safe practices. Families watched each other, offering guidance or intervention when tasks were risky. Apprentices observed masters repeatedly to internalize safe techniques. Children learned indirectly through modeling and correction, developing intuition about risk long before formal rules or regulations existed. Safety became a shared responsibility, not merely an individual concern. In conclusion, tools, machinery, and daily chores were a constant source of danger in medieval life. Survival relied on observation, instruction, careful handling, and collective vigilance. Hand tools, mills, kitchen implements, and livestock demanded skill, attention, and respect. Communities developed informal systems of training, emergency response, and situational awareness to mitigate these hazards. The medieval world, though lacking modern safety features, demonstrated a profound understanding of risk management, passing practical knowledge across generations to preserve life amidst ever-present dangers. Medieval towns and villages were defined by their buildings, walls, and towers, all of which required constant maintenance and construction. The work of building, repairing, and maintaining structures introduced dangers that were immediate and visible, particularly the risk of falling from heights. Scaffolds, ladders, rooftops, and towers presented daily threats, and survival depended on skill, coordination, and careful observation. This section explores how people mitigated these risks through technique, culture, and shared vigilance. Scaffolding was rudimentary, yet indispensable. Builders constructed wooden platforms and ladders to reach higher walls or roofs. Nails, ropes, and beams formed basic structures, often with minimal redundancy. Workers had to rely on balance, strength, and careful placement to prevent collapse. Scaffolds were rarely permanent, meaning each new structure required inspection and adjustment. Experienced masons and carpenters developed informal methods to reinforce platforms, distribute weight, and stabilize ladders. These practices were passed from master to apprentice, emphasizing both practical skill and a cautious mindset. Rooftop work was particularly dangerous. Thatchers, carpenters, and roofers navigated steep angles and slippery surfaces, often carrying heavy tools or materials. A single misstep could result in serious injury or death. Workers learned to spread weight evenly, maintain 3 points of contact, and move deliberately. Seasonal awareness also influenced safety. Wet, icy, or moss-covered roofs were particularly treacherous, prompting some work to be delayed or adjusted according to conditions. Attention to environmental factors was as important as skill in preventing falls. Ladders were another common source of accidents. Wooden ladders were heavy and often uneven, requiring stable placement and careful climbing. Workers developed techniques to brace ladders, tie them to beams, or work in pairs to reduce risk. Even so, fatigue, distraction, or poorly maintained ladders could result in catastrophic falls. Knowledge of safe ladder use became ingrained in workshop culture, forming part of the informal education of all those who worked above ground. Urban construction added additional hazards. Streets were narrow, materials were stored nearby, and towns were densely populated. Passing pedestrians or animals could jostle ladders or scaffolding, creating unexpected danger. Skilled workers anticipated these interactions, maintaining clear communication and watching for environmental disruptions. Coordination became a critical aspect of safety, demonstrating that risk management extended beyond personal skill to include awareness of others and surroundings. Vaulted ceilings, towers, and fortifications demanded extraordinary care. Masonry work often required lifting and positioning large stones, balancing them precisely while standing at significant heights. Teams developed signals, chants, or routines to coordinate movements and prevent mishaps. Observation of weight distribution, timing, and structural stability became essential knowledge. Apprentices watched masters closely, internalizing subtle cues about how materials behaved under stress and how human bodies should move safely. Falling objects posed additional hazards. Tools, beams, and loose stones could endanger workers below. To mitigate this, communities developed simple but effective practices, storing tools safely, using ropes to lower materials, and alerting colleagues with verbal signals. Awareness of overhead risks became as vital as attention to personal balance, emphasizing a culture of vigilance that extended throughout construction sites. Domestic maintenance introduced similar challenges. Roof repairs, chimney cleaning, and loft storage required climbing ladders or standing on beams. Household members learned to stabilize ladders, carry tools securely, and avoid rushing tasks. Even seemingly minor work could result in serious injury if caution was ignored. Experience guided daily practice, making awareness and preparation habitual. Guilds and training institutions reinforced safety culture. Apprentices learned step-by-step procedures, emphasizing observation, careful movement, and respect for environmental conditions. Masters demonstrated hazards and recovery techniques, while social reinforcement encouraged adherence to safe practices. Observing experienced workers, hearing stories of accidents, and participating in supervised work created an apprenticeship environment focused on both skill and safety. Environmental conditions played a major role in risk management. Rain, wind, snow, and ice could transform a routine task into a deadly one. Workers adapted by adjusting schedules, using wedges and braces, or modifying platform construction. Seasonal knowledge, passed from year to year, helped prevent accidents in climates with variable weather. Attentiveness to surroundings and anticipation of risk became an essential aspect of skilled labor. Emergency response was largely informal but practical. Simple splints, herbal poultices, and compresses were available for minor injuries. Neighbors, colleagues, and family members provided immediate aid, emphasizing the communal nature of survival. Stories of falls and recovery shaped cultural memory, reinforcing caution and safe practice. Lessons learned through observation and experience were integrated into daily routines, minimizing recurrence of preventable accidents. In conclusion, construction and maintenance in medieval towns were fraught with risk, particularly from falls and accidents at height. Scaffolding, ladders, rooftops, and towers demanded balance, skill, and environmental awareness. Workers relied on observation, coordination, apprenticeship, and practical engineering to mitigate danger. Communities developed a culture of vigilance and shared responsibility, recognizing that survival depended not only on individual skill, but also on cooperation, foresight, and respect for the hazards inherent in everyday labor. In the medieval world, danger was not confined to workshops, mills, or construction sites. It was also deeply embedded in the household. Daily life revolved around open flames, heavy objects, sharp tools, and precarious structures. Kitchens, hearths, and storage areas were centers of both nourishment and hazard. This section explores how households managed these constant risks, developing routines, social norms, and practical knowledge to survive in a world where a single moment of inattention could lead to serious injury or death. Open hearths were central to domestic life, providing warmth, cooking facilities, and light, yet they posed ever-present threats of burns, fire, and accidental ignition. Cooking vessels were heavy, often filled with boiling water, soups, or fats. A slip or sudden movement could spill scalding liquids, causing severe injury. Household members developed careful routines, positioning pots securely, using long-handled utensils, and moving deliberately around hot surfaces. Children were instructed to stay at a safe distance unless supervised, and apprentices or helpers learned step-by-step techniques to minimize exposure. Lighting was another hazard. Candles, rushlights, and torches illuminated homes, but could ignite clothing, bedding, or wooden furniture. People became skilled at managing flames, using protective holders, placing candles on stable surfaces, and monitoring unattended lights. Nighttime movement was cautious, guided by experience and habit, with families teaching children to respect fire as both a tool and a threat. Heavy lifting and storage introduced additional risks. Barrels of grain, sacks of flour, or bundles of firewood were common in households and workshops. Improper lifting could cause muscle strain, crush fingers, or result in accidents when stacked objects toppled. Practical techniques for lifting, balancing loads, and arranging storage became part of daily knowledge. Families and apprentices learned through observation and repetition, creating a culture of caution in routine handling of heavy materials. Tools in the home extended the hazards already present in workshops. Knives for cooking, scissors for textiles, and small hand tools for repairs all posed cutting risks. Routine care, such as sharpening, cleaning, and proper storage, reduced danger. Households developed designated areas for tools, preventing accidental contact and protecting children from injury. Skills passed down through generations emphasized both efficiency and caution, making safe handling second nature. Water management contributed to safety within homes. Open containers, spills, and uneven floors could create slip hazards, particularly in kitchens and cellars. Households learned to maintain clear pathways, mop spills, and position buckets strategically. Awareness of slippery surfaces and careful footwork prevented many injuries, showing that risk management extended beyond visible dangers to include subtle environmental factors. Domestic animals added a layer of complexity. Cats, dogs, chickens, and pigs were common in towns and villages. Animals could knock over containers, bite, or otherwise disrupt household routines, potentially leading to accidents with fire, tools, or heavy objects. Families learned to segregate animals, use pens, and train them to minimize disruption, reflecting an intuitive understanding of cohabitation risk. Social organization within households also supported safety. Tasks were divided by skill, experience, and physical ability. Children and novices were assigned lower risk responsibilities, while adults and skilled household members handled more dangerous chores. Guidance and supervision were constant, ensuring that hazardous tasks were completed under controlled conditions. This structure was an early form of risk allocation, distributing danger in a way that minimized overall harm. Knowledge transfer was critical. Parents, apprentices, and older siblings instructed younger members through demonstration and correction. Stories of past accidents, burns, falls, or tool injuries served as cautionary lessons. Repetition, observation, and reinforcement ensured that practical knowledge became embedded in daily behavior, creating a culture of vigilance and preparedness within the home. Accidents, when they occurred, were treated pragmatically. Simple remedies included herbal poultices, bandages, and compresses. Families relied on community healers or knowledgeable neighbors for more serious injuries. This blend of immediate care, social support, and preventative habits illustrates the interplay between risk, culture, and survival in domestic life. In conclusion, the medieval household was a nexus of daily hazards, combining fire, tools, heavy lifting, water, and animals. Survival depended on careful observation, structured routines, social instruction, and communal vigilance. Knowledge of risk was passed down through practical experience, storytelling, and apprenticeship, creating a culture in which safety became a habitual part of daily life. Even without modern safety features, households developed sophisticated methods to reduce accidents, demonstrating human ingenuity and adaptability in an environment where danger was constant and ever present.